It's my great pleasure to introduce Col Mack Russell. I almost feel as if Col Mack doesn't need an introduction. You all know him as the managing director of Nurture Development, that is the leading asset-based community development organisation in Europe. He is passionate about community-driven change and citizen-centred democracy, and has been a massive influence on many of us in the way that we think and the way that we work in the community development space. I recommend to you his book on Rekindling Democracy. It is superb, highly readable and very informative. Our chair today is Iwan Thomas. I'd like to describe Iwan as a national treasure. He is Chief Executive of PLANED, which is a community development organisation very much embedded in communities across Wales. And he's very much in the business of supporting real change. So we have now about an hour, and I'm going to go straight into the programme, and we'll start with an input from Col Mack. Please mute your microphone, we can hear a lot of background noise. We have about an hour in which we'll start with an input from Col Mack, getting into discussion with Iwan, and then we will put some questions to Col Mack that many of you have submitted to us. So we have an hour, and I'd like you to sit back and enjoy the discussion, enjoy the conversation. It's going to be a really good session. So over to you, Iwan.
Great, thank you, Sue. Bore da, good morning, everyone. Lovely to see so many friends, colleagues and partners here, and obviously working together, PLANED, PABS and Solver Care under the Together for Change banner. Really I'm thrilled that Col Mack's been able to join us here this morning. So from all of us here, big croeso, big welcome to you, Col Mack. Lovely to see you.
Thank you. That's so wonderful and so great to be here as well, because I owe you an apology to start with for missing the jamboree on the last occasion. So my apologies for that. Technical difficulties undid me. But let's just start, if we can, by making sure that everybody is muted, because there's still white noise coming in the background. That's as much for everybody else on the call as me, actually, because we want to make sure that we're respectful of people. You know, we all have sensory diversity, diverse ways of actually being able to engage online. So thank you for that.
Great, thank you, Col Mack. I mean, we'll kind of start, and really looking forward to this discussion with yourself in terms of, obviously, you've got the latest publication out, Rekindling Democracy, which many of us have obviously kind of read, but obviously in terms of Nurture Development, as Sue rightly said, in terms of some of the blog articles, and obviously in terms of what you're promoting through social media, which many of us kind of consider, latch onto, and really kind of open up our thought process. And I'd like to kind of start off, Col Mack, if I may, in terms of one of your most recent social media posts, if I can. Many of us follow you on social media, and yesterday you highlighted, which was really interesting, the term hard to reach should perhaps be better kind of used in terms of, or replaced, I should say, with seldom listened to. So I suppose to kind of start this kind of discussion this morning, how important is the use of terminology in supporting and promoting, do you think, communities and that role of communities, and making sure that we use the right phraseology, terminology and so forth?
Well, I think we can take our cue from great wisdom holders like Evan Roberts, who would have thought the importance of language, right? And particularly language traditions that are indigenous. And there's so much meaning in words, but also in the language that's used. So there's a big difference between the Queen's English and our mother tongue, our home language. So the question is, so in part, it's about language, but it's in part about who is actually holding the power within the language, So when we say hard to reach, I think that's the Queen's English. that's the empire, that's Caesar saying, I can't reach you. Mind you, they can reach people very well when it comes to taxation and arrest and other things. So there's something about the institution, the power holder, saying this is the world as we see it. So it's language and words that are used through the eyes of the state. Nothing wrong with the state. I'm not anti-state or anything like that, but it's to be aware of that. And when words come out through the eyes and the mouth of the state, they're different than when they come out through the mouths of individuals, citizens, local people. So that's the first thing. So when we say a service user, it's important to be clear that that language is the Queen's English. That is not the language that Evan Roberts would have used, right? And it's really important that when we speak through the mouth of indigenous wisdom and we speak through the mouth of the state, it just comes out differently, not good, not bad, but very, very different. So when I say you're an end user, you're a service user, you're hard to reach, or you're very cooperative, or you're doing really well now with your line of therapy or whatever it might be, I'm defining you by your relationship to the services that I provide for you, whether you receive them, consume them, or whatever. You're defined both by your relationship to the services and how you're consuming or not. Now, this is very different, I think, to what we're talking about here today, which is about, number one, not defining people out of their community and out of their own lived experiences and out of their own language, and certainly not redefining them into service land. So when we say hard to reach, there's a world of loaded terminology in there, and it's quite colonial. So what I'm doing sometimes when I put that out is I'm checking my own privilege as much as anything, because I can also use language in a way that's not aware of the power implications. So the question is always, how are we using these words? And are we defining people out of community and into service land? Or are we lifting the community up, the power of community, with the words that we use? That's why I defer to Evan Roberts' wisdom in that regard, because I think that's what he was doing, featuring the language, featuring the wisdom, featuring the community alternatives.
No, that's great, Cormac. And I'd like to kind of perhaps embellish a bit more on community and obviously some of your work in that particular area. I think, we're all in a current environment now with the new COVID variant, and we're looking at perhaps a return to larger restrictions. And obviously within communities, we, see the effects of that. And when I was kind of doing a bit of research last night, I kind of thought, well, what perhaps were your thoughts when COVID first kind of came to the fore in March, April of last year? So I hope you don't mind. I went back and looked at your articles, which you published, I think it was April last year. And you talked about the response of communities to COVID at that time. And I think there are parallels with what we see in communities now in terms of that community development and that kind of empowerment of communities. But it was interesting that you talked about sometimes the initial response, particularly from our larger public sector organizations, is to, and I think what you called it was fixing that fail. And sometimes that perhaps doesn't kind of address the longer term sustainable issue within our communities. And obviously, as you've kind of reflected over many kind of articles, the empowerment that you've seen across communities, as we have here in Pembrokeshire, has been tremendous. So I suppose, how would you suggest now the community's knowledge and expertise is better harnessed and incorporated into those more sustainable solutions that is grassroots-led and focused?
So I think one of the things that really struck me last year, and actually my wife said it to me this morning, she said, the articles that you were writing in 2020 are as, and probably more current today.
Absolutely.
And she used a metaphor which I was really taken by, because she's been following this very closely. She's very active in our own community, and particularly exercised at the moment by concerns of certain people who are very susceptible to the new variant and getting a bit cross at the slowness of information, whatever. So we had a good chat this morning, but she was saying her feeling is that many of the governmental responses around the world are a bit like, she used the metaphor of the Chinese finger trap. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but basically it's where the more you try to pull out, the more entrapped you become. And I thought it was a very good way of thinking about the last year or so. So what I was saying last year was essentially, and I use my hands to illustrate this because I think it's really important and it's really useful in terms of thinking about empowerment and really breaking down the term. And again, going back to language. So I think what we saw in March and April of 2020 was systems, institutions hitting the limits of their capacity. And for the first time probably in modern history, after the First and Second World War, institutions saying, we cannot do this on our own. And in fact, with furloughing, with explicitly saying our health system could be overrun if we don't mobilize. I think what was happening was you could kind of use a hydraulic metaphor. So on one side, the piston of institutional responses was going down. So our kids were coming home. There's a function that used to be in the institutional world, which now at our kitchen table or wherever we were trying to teach our own, right? So literally that function came back home. We had the experience, I would say, the privilege, but also in part the sad challenge of supporting people in our community as death doulas because they were dying at home. Literally, so outsourcing people to the institutional world no longer became an option. Now, I'm not, obviously, hospice, end-of-life care, school, they're all really important institutions, but there was a moment in time where many Western cultures hit the limits of what the institutional world could do. So that piston went down. And lo and behold, what went up on the other side? Community. So this kind of pays lie to the idea that the institutional world empowers us on the community side. I think what it highlights is that sometimes the institutional world is so domineering and so dominant and so taking on of the functions that often belong most appropriately in the community side, that the community feel underqualified or uncredentialed in the act of taking on these functions. Who am I to teach my own? Who am I to see somebody at end of life to their final hours? I am not qualified. But when the institution says, actually, here's the limits of what we can do, and here's how we really need you to show up, then suddenly it becomes what I would describe as a precipitating act. So literally, COVID precipitated community response by reducing the power in our mind, the all-embracing power of the institution, and actually waking us up to the possibility of community responses. Now, I think what we're constantly trying to talk about when we talk about empowerment is the wrong way around. We've kind of got this notion that institutions will do something to empower us, but nobody empowers another human being. If I empower you, then I've got the power. That means I can take it away from you. That's not empowerment. That's nonsense. That's gaslighting. And that's precisely what a lot of governments have been doing. So by early summer, we were seeing the resurrection, the resurgence of mutual aid groups, which were there all along. It was kind of almost like, seeds just waiting to be watered. So they rose to the challenge. And then I think an element of what we saw at the back end of summer was as things started to calm down and lockdown started opening up, we started seeing the piston of institutions coming in again and saying, oh, we'd love to fund you if you're a mutual aid group, but here are all the rules that you have to comply with in order for you to actually get the money. And so we started seeing there again, under the banner of empowerment, by the way, which is again the great irony, we started seeing institutions coming in and being out of right relationship with the community, not understanding that actually their job is to create the environment for self-empowerment. And that's a great misunderstanding in an awful lot of the legislation in Wales and in Scotland as well, I would say. And the other difficulty with this is that so much of it gets framed in the individual narrative, what matters to you. But what we saw in the first lockdown responses, it wasn't just what matters to me, it's what matters to me and my neighbours. So the place that we live in, and this is where I think Wales really are world leaders in recognizing that the small bounded place, the village, the neighborhood, the town, the outer state, that's the primary unit of change. Not me, but us, we. So that's it's baked into the very DNA of how you show up in the world. And sadly, there are many Western contexts where that isn't the case.
And I think it's interesting in terms of how you define, very clearly that kind of shift in terms of empowerment, but it's something that, is not something that people can take. It's something which, as you say, you share within that community, be it a village, a hamlet, a cluster within a town, whatever it may be. It's about people at the end of the day. And I think, there are numerous examples across Wales, particularly of where we've seen people come together. And as you say, I think, in Wales, we've done a really good job in terms of looking at our kind of communities and what resources and skills we have. I know within Pembrokeshire, we've got colleagues from the Association of Voluntary Services here, PAVS, who kind of very much leading, working hand in hand with the local authority at the time to kind of create now what we now have as a hub to bring those kind of groups which suddenly kind of came into being through the results of COVID, to have that sustainable kind of output. The same as we've seen as colleagues in North Wales here from Cwmni Bro Festiniog, who do a fantastic job within their community. And that's replicated in many other communities across Wales. Taking that in terms of what you were just saying, Col Mack, and going back into your new book, you talk about the move from deliverables to discoverables. And I think in terms of what we've discovered within our communities over the last 18 months is this untapped resource and knowledge, which, as you say now, is moving in a different direction. And if we get that equilibrium between what we can actually deliver, but what we actually discover within our communities, that is going to hopefully provide a more sustainable shift in how we work with and for people. Is there anything perhaps you want to kind of expand in terms of that move from discoverables to deliverables or vice versa?
So a way of thinking about this conceptually is just a really simple idea of a 3-lane swimming pool, okay? Where in the first lane, whatever your issue is, it could be anything from, responding to climate change to caring for people at end of life. There can be lots of different things that switch people on and matter on a day-to-day basis for people and for communities. So I think in that first lane of the 3-lane swimming pool, there's a whole range of things that we think of that are important: health, raising our children, care, that really are in the hands of communities if we support people living in communities to get organized, to get connected. And I think that's the first lane of the swimming pool. The second is that there's things that people in communities can do where they're in the lead, but they have a little bit of support. So it's the right light touch amount of support. This is very much what the tradition of E.F. Schumacher, where he talked about small is beautiful. So it's about putting communities in the driving seat, but serving them. Right. So this idea they're in the lead, and public service and third sector organizations are not the voice of community, but they're in service to community. We serve at their pleasure, right? But there can be no community. We can't, this is why I'm very cautious about terms like community engagement. You can't engage with what's not there, right? So there's something about giving community, or the people in community, the space to get organized, to get connected, to build power, to build agency, and to take on functions. And that takes time, right? They're the first 2 lanes. And the third lane is there's whole sets of things that we do need our institutions to do for us. So you could go back to it and say, there's things we do by ourselves. If we could remove the barriers and support people to connect more powerfully, there's things we do by ourselves, but with a little bit of help. That's the second lane. And then there are things that are left over that we need done for us, right? Now, my argument is we can't know what institutions should be doing for us until we discover what we can do by ourselves and with a little bit of help. That's the sequence. You can't know that unless you're prepared to discover that. So then the question becomes, what gets in the way of this discovery? Well, I'll tell you, delivery, managerialism, bureaucracy, red tape, right? So we know this, siloed thinking, imperialism, like we know best. That's what gets in the way. So in a very simple way, right, at a very local kind of basic level, you go into a community and you're, say a community development worker even, and somebody says to you, we're sick and tired of your kind coming in here, right? Always asking us questions, always trying to, find out what we need, and then not following through. I mean, we've all heard this at one stage or another. We may have even said it, right? Now, at that moment, you've got a choice as a practitioner. Now, forget governmental policy, but just as a practitioner, as a person, or even as a volunteer. You can choose to listen to that person and say, tell me more about why you're tired and what is it I need to do to not exhaust you and maybe bring some energy to this, right? That's the context. What we largely do is we move into our commentary. Well, I'm different. It's different. I'm working for this organ, so the person says, I've just told you something. I've just given you something on a platter. If you were in discovery mode and you were interested in building trust with me, it's there for you. But you didn't take the time to listen, so bugger off. And that's the way it happens. Now, that's the most basic scale. And then you could just scale that up, scale that up, scale that up. I think that perfectly explains a lot. Now, COVID was totally in discovery mode. COVID works in discovery mode. And as a SARS strain, nearly 12 years ago, when the first strain came out, it was in discovery mode as well, right? Just like Ebola. And what institutions discovered is exactly the same thing that they discovered with AIDS in the 80s. If you don't get serious about supporting people to be responsive to these issues at the local level, in whatever way they understand that to be, then you're not going to deal with this top down with delivery of instruction on a command and control basis or delivery of vaccines. We will not jab our way out of this. It's an important response to it. We won't wash our hands out of this. We have to have an all community response way of doing this, right? And a big part of that is participatory processes. Now, the biggest dilemma here, as you know, Ewan, is we're constantly in this struggle between genuine participatory ways of working that go at the speed of trust and product. I need to get my KPIs met. I need to, it's coming to Christmas. We need to spend our money. How can we ping it over the wall, etc. So this product versus process is just, it's eternal, right? And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about ABCD or any other community development or relationship-based approach. That's the tension. So what I'm talking about is we can't know what a community needs until we first know what a community has. And you can't discover that unless you go and find out. That's the discovery. So whatever processes you use to discover, I'm agnostic about ABCD or otherwise. I think let's bring it all, but we need to make that a really important starting block. And we need to say to commissioners, to policymakers, to procurement officers, and to people who have managerial responsibility, back up and back off. Before you bring your commentary, listen.
I think, you've really kind of brought together within that kind of answer there what many of us feel, what many of us are facing across communities in terms of, as you say, product versus process, and for people to actually listen to hear what we need to discover within our communities first before we actually then go forward and actually utilise and take that forward. I wonder, Cormac, in terms of your kind of view on what is happening in terms of funding at the moment regarding COVID and communities, we're seeing a lot of money being pumped in, but for a very short-term basis. And I think it goes back to what we talked about some moments ago in terms of, quick fixes, but fixes that fail, because we're not looking, as you've rightly said, about what we can discover within our communities to provide that more sustainable solution. Now, many of us on this particular call this morning are, kind of responding to these, calls for there's so much funding available, but it's only available for X number of months. How do we as communities, perhaps, as you've just, very articulately kind of responded to, in terms of get our kind of feelings across to those policymakers, to government, to try and get them to understand that these kind of quick products are very much process driven from their agenda, and it's not listening to that community agenda? And are there kind of things that perhaps communities can do collectively to really shape and inform a longer term sustainable dialogue with government and with funding organizations?
You see, I think it's such an important question, because you take climate responses, for example, which again, I think I would say Wales and Scotland are really punching well above their weight internationally. And it's to my regret that local community responses to climate change didn't feature more in Glasgow a couple of weeks ago. I think there are reasons for that. And part of the reason is first of all, to really understand the power of community, we have to be honest about the limits, take climate, the limits of centralized, non-renewable, dirty sources of power that are fueling something in the region of 90 to 95% of our factories, our homes, and our cars. And so when we say, let's get serious about community alternatives and community responses, we're not just talking about relief action. We're not just talking about, let's do this because, our poor communities are after going through a really difficult time, so let's move in there. And I think most governments right now are in this kind of narrative between command and control, let's get people to comply, and kind of gaslighting people then when they don't fulfill personal responsibility. So largely, and I saw it on Twitter actually, some challenge around what do we mean by the public? And I would agree, we shouldn't be talking about the public, we should be talking about communities in the very real local sense. If you look at the likes of the community on the Isle of Egg, the Scottish community that were the first community in 2008 to go off grid completely, I think one of the things that's really interesting about what they've done is they've done that, which is fabulous. I mean, it's amazing. But they've also done it in a way that unashamedly has created resource and revenue for them. So they're able to take that money and invest in their own ideas for, land trusts, entrepreneurial ideas, and saying to young people, because most island communities, their biggest exports are their young people, and saying to young people, if you've got an idea, if you've got an aspiration to grow up here and marry here and have kids here or whatever, have family life here in whatever way that finds expression, then we'll back you. And that message is sent to those kids from the day they go to school, that they live in a community that has their back, and that they're not waiting for an external resource. I think the attitude on the Isle of Egg is this revolution won't be funded, So I think there's something yes, about having a better relationship with government. And we absolutely have to establish that the sort of relief response that we're seeing at the moment, these emergency responses and short-termism, are the wrong way around. That this is actually a really profound opportunity to press the reset button. And instead of these kinds of facile narratives where we're using militaristic language or leveling up or any of that nonsense, I think it's about saying it's an opportunity to relocate authority. You know, so it's not about relief action. It's about reordering the structure of society. And clearly things are so profoundly out of kilter, we need to do that. Now, most of what we'll use to do that is invisible in our communities. So I feel a lot of, you know, the stuff that we do, it's very much focused on the individual, and it's focused on relief action, and at best projects and activities. So you end up with things that are quite transactional and short term. But it feels to me that we really need to be much, much clearer about why community alternatives are more sustainable and more impactful over time. And I think that's work still to be done, to be honest.
I'd like to kind of tease that out a little bit more, if I may, Cormac, in terms of sustainability. And it's interesting, as you were talking there, a number of colleagues and friends on the call here are obviously making some fantastic comments and questions within the chat. And obviously one of the comments from one of our colleagues, Sue Leonard, was saying, do we always need a crisis to be in discovery mode? But I think what I'd like to kind of pick up is in terms of, you were talking about communities and the response in terms of where we're at the moment. And one of the questions which was submitted in advance from our colleague Gwyneth Jones and Pavs was asking, have we as communities got the strengths in place to see us through another kind of pandemic, another lockdown? What is important that we need to kind of look at within our communities to get through whatever else is coming around the corner potentially? What are your thoughts on that, Cormac?
Well, I think it's a great question. I think it's really important to say that what crises do is they precipitate community responses. So I would say the question is, what are the positive precipitants that we need to be more intentional about? What, like if you think about the different ways that we try to make change happen in this world, there's three basic ways. One is, you are a rugged individual, be resilient, do your therapy, resolve your trauma, get well. That's one model, right? The lone ranger. Right? And there's some argument for that. I'm not saying it's completely wrong. I'm just saying it's limited, right? I don't think we are totally self-reliant. I think we're other reliant. So we're much more interdependent than we want to admit. But that's one model. The second model is managed space. So let's bring the person into managed space, service them, program them, intervene in their lives, fix them. And the third is shared space. Now, if you look at pandemics, if you look at what they teach us exactly the same thing as heat waves taught us in Europe in 2003. When 70,000 people died across Europe in 10 days. Now look at the life claim on that, by the way, right? It really puts things in perspective. Most people don't even remember this trauma, by the way. We'll remember hurricanes and we'll remember other such things, but 70,000 people died across Europe in a 10-day period during the first fortnight of August in 2003. And hardly anybody knows this in their consciousness. Right. And it was largely not a failure of individual resilience. And it wasn't a failure of managed systems. So it wasn't like, the institutions didn't do their job. It was a failure of how people in modern life share space and build community together. So most of the people who died across Europe were over 65, were women, interestingly, living alone in poor urban substandard housing. And loneliness or isolation was the key determinant of whether you would live or die in a pandemic and in a heat wave, right? So if we're like, I would say rather than resilience, I'm really interested in this idea of anti-fragility. right? And without being too technical about it, I think the challenge is absolutely a big wake-up call to, if we're moving into what I'm describing as a pandemic conscious future, I think it's facile and it's a little bit childish to talk about when this pandemic is over. We did the exact same thing 10 years ago with SARS when it started, and we didn't actually plan ahead and build anti-fragility into our communities. There's an opportunity now, I believe, to start focusing in on the weakest of the three pillars of responsiveness in a crisis. That's shared space. That is where we as human species are most vulnerable. We have focused too much on individual resilience and on institutional responses to individuals. And where we absolutely have to build anti-fragility is around citizenship and community response. Are we there yet, as the child said in the back of the car? I don't think so. Have we got what we need? Absolutely. Will we use it? Will we connect it? Well, we can. We know we can. But there is a question about how to precipitate that. And you know, that remains the perennial struggle. And it's why we have these conversations, why we write these books, why we continue to show up every day. And that is a bit like marriage. It is built on the everyday occurrences of how you express affection, care, love, not just for yourself and your family, but for your communities. And it really is a question of how we contribute. And it's a question of shifting from a very dominant narrative, which is the scarcity narrative, to a narrative of abundance.
Can I pick that up then in terms of, as you say, Col Mack, shifting the narrative? Now, I mean, as you say, we can have, these are fantastic articles, publications, collective discussions in terms of ABCD. And one of the questions which colleagues kind of submitted, funny enough, before we came to this morning's session, kind of picks up on that really, and we'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on this in terms of how can ABCD approaches truly gain traction politically here across the UK, in the devolved governments and in Westminster, and how we can all work together perhaps a bit smarter to actually make it happen. What are your kind of thoughts on, you know, how we can actually get, you know, ABCD into the wider political arena and into that agenda to actually then be discovered, I suppose, by the political elite as a sustainable long-term, you know, solution?
Yeah. So there are a couple of answers to that I think are quite precise, but let me issue some cautions first of all, because I think the way we ask our questions can either lead us to feel more resourceful and powerful or more dependent and powerless. And I think the minute we frame our questions around how can we get the external to take us more seriously, we're immediately and subconsciously handing our power over. So I think the first thing we have to do is we have to conserve our energy and say, what we do is not about performing to the external. It's about building, connecting, and mobilizing the internal first. Now, part of that is we get to a point where we would then be organized enough and powerful enough to say to external actors, we want you to create a dome of protection. If you're public service, we want you to create a dome of protection around our inventiveness. We want you to do no harm yourself, but also protect us from harm from predatory forces. So that's a function that we see you having. And currently, I'm not sure that you know, a lot of governments articulate that, or politicians or even policymakers understand that their role is not a role of provision or rescue necessarily, but it's creating a dome of protection for our capacities to be powerful, to be at the center of democracy. So here's a key thing. If our questions and our policies are defining the role of the citizen as that which happens after the important work of policymakers and professionals is done, we're sunk from the beginning. It's the wrong framing. The framing needs to be, we will define the role of professionals and policymakers as what happens after the central work of citizenship is done. They serve at our pleasure, not the other way around. This isn't about us turning their head. It's about us making sure that they understand they're the rudder on our boat, right? They're not the ship's captain. And so it struck me that the questions carry the criteria of their answers. And we need to be very thoughtful about the way we ask our questions and the way we're inviting people to the conversation. So there's something there about, you know, when you look at the community banking movement, which is growing in Australia, that's saying to government, if you don't get your act together as funders, we'll create our own alternative funding and we'll make you irrelevant. So when you come to the table, you will come as a guest in our conversation. We will interview you, consider whether your investment is actually proportionate or not. And if you're lucky, on a good day, we may actually accept the investment, but we'll be auditing you, not you auditing us. Because any of the, you know, you look at an awful lot of the way projects are being evaluated that are being funded by the state, and it's brutal. It really is a brutalist auditing. You know, it's the opposite of the message, which is we trust you, we believe in you. Now, this is another thing that really happened, which was very interesting. In the face of crisis in March and April, we saw Big Lottery and a lot of other very big funders saying, we trust you. Do whatever you think is best in your context, and we have your back. And it's that kind of stuff. So we know it can be done, and it can be done on the turn of a dime if the situation is in place. There's a wonderful question of earlier on, do we need crisis? What crisis did was it pushed people's egos back. And suddenly the limits of the institutional world became undeniable. And the need for community also became undeniable at the same stage. So if we want better relationships with government, I think it's really, really critical that we start politically looking at how do we build much more power at the grassroots level. So neighborhood democracy, I think, is going to be a really important movement. The reestablishment of cooperatives. If you look at places, regions like Emilia-Romagna in Italy, where 1 in every 3 euros is generated by cooperatives. There's no debate about community there. Local government know their place. Central government know their place. But then you look at places which are like, you know, very neoliberal in their thinking. So take, for example, the province of Alberta, which would be very kind of anti-mask, anti-vax, anti-pretty much everything, and very much about the individual. The state must not intervene. It's all about the individual. So it's uber libertarianism. I mean, what's really interesting there, and it's such an irony, is 50% of the tax take in the state of Alberta goes into hospitalization of people in Alberta, right? And 50% of that 50% is going into hospitalizing people and actually making them unwell as a result. But because they're not able to create community alternatives and work more effectively with the third sector, you know, now that's shifting, but because of that, there's a real contradiction. They're talking out of both sides of their mouth. So at one level, they're saying, you know, I want to be independent. At another level, they're saying, take 50% of my money and hospitalize my mother. I mean, how do you square these two things? It's a bit like, you know, the Trumpite narrative where people's, I'm a self-made man, you know, whatever, in their 70s and 80s. And you say, okay, did you serve in any of the recent wars? And you hear they served in Korea or they served in Vietnam or whatever, First World War, Second World War. And you ask, were you a beneficiary of the GI Bill of Rights? And 50 to maybe 70% of the room are. And you say, well, then, pal, you are not a self-made man. The government found a way of supporting you when you came back from war so that you could be valuable in your community. And this is a critical thing. I think another function of government is to distribute wealth. And one of the things that governments have lost their way around is they've started to think about themselves as the providers only of services. And what we have to do is start thinking about how can our wealth, the wealth of our nation, be distributed so everybody's gift can be contributed. And that might not always be about work. It might be about contributions in other ways, but that everybody has a valued social role. They're not known by their label, and that we as a society organize to include people who are neurodiverse, who have sensory diversity in terms of how they engage, which is all of us. But that we're actively working to use our resource to create not the mass production, but the production of the masses. So everybody feels creative. Everybody feels that their gifts can be given and received. That's certainly my dream for the world that I'm in. And governments should be doing whatever they can to resource that. Funding then, just as a final thought on this, funding then must never be the fish. It's always the bait. The whole idea of using funding is to say, we think you are amazingly inventive, and we're going to use money, commissioning, influence to precipitate that invention and to connect it. Then we will supplement that inventiveness with services. That's the way it should be. And currently, most of our policymakers, I'm not even sure they have community life in their life. I think it's one of the things I would ask any policymaker who's making policy around government: how well related are you to your neighbors? How much community is in your life? I'm really struck by that actually many of the people who have most influence on the policies that impact on our lives don't have community in their life, and they have very skeptical views on community. I think we need to push back against that.
And I think, you raise a number of absolutely valid points there, Col Mack, and you talked about, grassroots, you talk about, we'd like to see more cooperatives within our society. And it's that connection between those who have the influence, but being removed from community, which I think, all of us have experienced, particularly in terms of getting that message to those people who can, but they have that kind of slight wall sometimes between, the kind of grassroots and, the strategic executive as such. I know we haven't got much time left, and I think, perhaps, we've covered a really broad range of kind of items and topics, which has been fantastic. But I suppose, looking at the bigger picture, are there kind of any examples within the UK? You've talked about the fantastic examples in Italy and Canada. Anything from your kind of engagements and experience across the UK, which perhaps you could signpost to us here in kind of Wales, in terms of where perhaps you think there are opportunities to really kind of forge that grassroots community-led movement? Because I think, looking at the chat again from colleagues and going back to, I think, your first kind of answer about terminology, many people refer to resilient communities, which kind of, it's almost as if there's a knee-jerk reaction because, we'll kind of respond to something. And as many colleagues have pointed out, perhaps the term should be resourceful communities, because there's a depth of resources across all our communities, which many people don't often acknowledge and actually utilize. So as we come to, I suppose, a kind of, in the last kind of 5-10 minutes, any examples from across the UK you think that perhaps we can learn from collectively and continue that open transparency of dialogue?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to say in Wales that the DNA is perfectly poised and it's really powerful work. So your attention to the vernacular, by which I mean the importance of, so what I think is distinctive in Wales, maybe even above Scotland, is that if you take it that there are three things that fundamentally a citizen will do. So if you say, let's check the health of citizenship, the first thing is that they define things in their own language. So somebody doesn't come in from outside and say, here's what you should be concerned about or you should create. Right. So when the police officer comes in and says, well, the big issue here is crime, then whoever defines the issue has the power, right? And they will be the key actors. That's a given you can take. So that's something I think you have in spades. The second is that in strong citizenship, you'll find that not alone do they define the possibility or the problem in their own language collectively, right? But they also are prepared to define the solution. So here's how we understand our possibility or a problem. And as a result, because we've taken ownership of defining it in our own language, in the vernacular, here's how we think it's best we respond, right? So this is what we can do ourselves. Here's what we need a little help with, and here's what we want you to do for us. So you're really in a very powerful position when you assume that kind of position. But the third is they see themselves as primary investors. So it isn't about, well, we've defined the problem, we think this is the solution, away you go now and externally come in and fix us, because we're on our knees, broken, useless people, right? And this is really important. Now, one of the things to say about being a resourceful community is that we're not a community to be pillaged. So when somebody goes, oh, you're wonderfully resourceful, you know, the NHS is on its knees, we need you now to use your resource to meet our targets. Well, the answer is bugger off, right? 80% of what determines our health and well-being has nothing to do with what the NHS provides, right? And actually, it's possible to be healthy and to be safe without being well and being free. So 15% of what determines our health and well-being are institutions, 85% is in communities. Now, I say all of that because when I give you examples from the UK, I want you to know that these are examples based on that caution. So what I'm very mindful, there's plenty of people around the UK who say we're doing asset-based community development, but largely what they're doing is they're using the language to try to appropriate assets from the community to meet their institutional targets, rather than saying these are resourceful communities that are doing things that are unique to them, that the institutional world can supplement but can never replace and shouldn't. And that includes the third sector. The third sector isn't and shouldn't be treated as a proxy for those resources in the community. They're a support. They're a close-up support, much closer than the third sector or the public sector. So with all of that as a caution, I would say what we're seeing in Leeds is very encouraging. In the city of Leeds, where, for example, one of their principles is success. What does success look like for every public servant and every third sector professional? It's what have we done today that has moved the city closer to everybody in the city, saying that they have 3 neighbours who are now their friends? Isn't that a great measure of success? In Leeds, we're seeing that measurement of success in terms of procurement, and we're seeing this in Newcastle and in York as well, is no longer about how many bums you get on seats, right, in your programs. So they're no longer measuring quality of program, they're measuring quality of life. And what I really like about this is it's the quality of life. And I would agree, Sam, yes, Sheffield as well. I think what they're basically saying is, let's measure quality of life by how interdependent people are in natural communities. Not how dependable the services are. Now, that's a given. That should be a baseline. We shouldn't be slapping ourselves in the back because we have dependable services. That's just should be a given. I think, like, for me, I suppose I like to kind of think as a social movement, but behave like an entrepreneur. So there's always this element of prospecting around the edge. So, I think we'll always be a bit fringe in this conversation. And in a sense, I'm not sure that it's helpful to start thinking about how do we get more mainstream. So I don't want to give the impression here that while I think the genie is out of the bottle, I don't think it's mainstream. I think mainstream is still very much doing things to people and for people, to be honest. The more progressives are doing things with people. What we're actually talking about is creating much more space for people to begin the journey of doing things by themselves and then holding us to account as we supplement that, and that being alongside people and cheering them on in that regard is our job and is our privilege. So there's Sheffield was mentioned. Look, I think also it's really interesting to remember, like, you look at the great work that has happened in Wales over the years around making sure that people who would have maybe traditionally been put into day wasting services, because they had a disability or another label, are now being brought back into community life for the gifts they have to contribute. I think you have done, as a nation, really important work in defining people out of service land and bringing them back into villages, bringing them back into community life all over Wales. And today, for example, you can now go into an awful lot of villages in Wales and see people who ostensibly 10, 15 years ago were in a service, who are now in a community and are contributing, are active members, are not known as service users, but Mary who likes, and that's a big deal. But it's still quite fringe, and maybe that's okay. It's okay for our movement to be a fringe movement, because in a lot of ways, that's where most of the fun is to be had. But I think we should still keep pushing, still keep prospecting, and constantly, with the spirit of entrepreneurship, continue to cause trouble. Brilliant.
Thank you, Cormac. That is a fantastic response and a fantastic way to bring this hour to a close. For me personally, I just want to say a huge thank you for taking part in this conversation and discussion this morning. It's been really enlightening, and it's been great to see colleagues in terms of the kind of chat on the side. So I'm going to hand back to my colleague Sue Denman just to kind of bring it to a close. But a huge thank you from me personally, Cormac, for going through that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Cormac and Iwan, for an inspirational discussion. It's been a joy to listen to, and I can see how engaged people have been by looking at the chat. I'd really like to encourage you all, those of you who've joined us, to look at Cormac's book, Rekindling Democracy, where he goes into a much more detail about some of the things that he's talked about, with many national and international examples. We are so keen on that book that we've got one each in our small team, actually, that we like it so much. So encourage you to have a look at that. And I know that Cormac has got another publication in the offing soon. I think he crowdsourced the title for it, which was very interesting to see on Twitter. So I'd like to thank you all for coming. Thank you for the many questions that you submitted. And do keep a lookout for some of our other events that we run throughout the year. Everybody is welcome. Everybody's welcome to bring something to the table and share. Thank you very, very much again, and take care. Have a good day. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe and stay in trouble.